CD 10. Under Rule 303, the short and shameful history of the Bushveld Carbineers. So, what exactly did happen in the Spelonken during those 283 days between the 21st of February 1901, when the Bushveld Carbineers Regiment was formed, and the 1st of December 1901, when the regiment ceased to exist? As Frederick de Bertodano had predicted, trouble began when Captain Taylor received word on the 2nd of July 1901 that a group of 6 Boers, accompanied by 2 covered wagons and a large herd of cattle, were coming into the fort, either to surrender or seek a truce for medical treatment. Taylor told Captain Robertson the fort was possibly going to be attacked and ordered Sergeant Major Morrison to intercept the group, ignore any white flags, take no prisoners, and make it look like a fight. Morrison apparently turned to Robertson and asked if he should obey Taylor's orders, and Robertson replied, "Certainly, he's commanding officer here." Morrison then sent Sergeant Oldham, Corporal Primrose and 5 other troopers from Sweetwater's farm to meet the group. The party consisted of 2 ox wagons driven by 2 boys aged 12 and 18, carrying 65-year-old farmer Jan Geiser, and 3 other men who had been members of the local Boer Commando unit. All were suffering from malaria and seeking treatment. They had a large herd of valuable cattle with them and a wooden cash box containing a large sum in paper money and gold bars, possibly being taken to safety away from the farm raids and burnings then sweeping the district. What happened next was later reported by witnesses at the Court of Inquiry. The patrol fired on the wagons and a white flag was raised. Believing that women and children might be present, Sergeant Oldham called "cease fire," disarmed the Boers, and then followed Taylor's orders by having each member of his patrol execute one of the group. Jan Geiser was found lying sick in one of the wagons, and Trooper Eden climbed into the wagon and shot him where he lay on his bed. Corporal Primrose returned to Sweetwater's to report, and most of A Squadron then rode to the scene, where, according to later witness testimony, 5 unarmed Boers were lying in the road, shot in the head, save one who was shot in the neck. Another was lying dead in the wagon under his blankets, never having got out of bed, shot in the head. Trooper Robert Cochrane testified that the oxen and cattle were stolen by Captain Taylor, secretly driven to Rhodesia, and sold at Bulawayo. Lieutenant Hancock took possession of the cash box, and the bodies were buried in a mass grave at the site. After the war, Jan Geiser's daughter wrote a letter describing the number of cattle involved and the contents of the wagons. Nothing was ever returned to the Geiser family. Captain Robertson reported to Major Lenihan that 6 train wreckers and murderers had been shot. This became known as the 6 Boers affair. Later that day, back at Fort Edward, Trooper Van Buren, an Afrikaner member of the Bushveld Carbineers, was seen talking to some women from the families of the victims who were being held for transport to the concentration camp at Pietersburg. Local men who signed up with the British were known as joiners, and Taylor often made use of them in his intelligence work. He was, however, worried about Van Buren and ordered Hancock to attend to the matter. 2 days later, Hancock took a patrol of 4 men, including Van Buren, scouting for Boer commandos. At the Court of Inquiry later that year, Trooper Churton testified that he saw Hancock ride up behind Van Buren and shoot him 3 times in the back. Hancock then said to Churton, "Keep a sharp lookout, we just lost a man back there." Hancock wrote a report that Captain Robertson amended as he deemed it unsuitable. Robertson reported to Lenihan at Pietersburg that Van Buren was shot in contact with some Boers. Major Lenihan and Colonel Hall were aware of the poor discipline, unconfirmed murders, drunkenness and general lawlessness at Fort Edward, and when it was reported that a local woman had accused a British officer of rape, an investigation revealed that the alleged rapist was Captain James Robertson. He was given a choice of being court-martialled or resigning his commission, and chose the latter option. Lenihan then withdrew the whole detachment from Fort Edward with the exception of Handcock, who, as the station's veterinary officer, was responsible for the horses. Some of the men withdrawn were ordered to remain at Petersburg awaiting an inquiry into their behaviour at Fort Edward. Some disobeyed this order and made threats about reporting on the activities of their officers at the fort. These men were allowed to leave by Colonel Hall without penalty and discharged from the regiment. Lenihan then appointed Captain Percy Hunt, formerly of the 10th Hussars and a good friend of Harry Morant, to straighten out the station. Lieutenant Morant and 60 men were also sent to Fort Edward with Hunt. Lieutenant Whitten's assessment of the situation as it existed before he and Morant arrived at Fort Edward was that Robertson was altogether unfit to command such a body of men and allowed his detachment to drift into a state of insubordination verging on mutiny. The men did almost as they liked, and horses and other captured stock were being divided amongst themselves, while stills on neighbouring farms were freely made use of. Any consideration of what later became generally known as the Breaker-Morant affair should take into account the fact that all of the events described above occurred before Morant was ever stationed at Fort Edward. Over the next month, 18 Boers were captured and 500 cattle and 15 wagons were confiscated. Taylor was still playing an active role in directing activities at Fort Edward, and problems continued under Hunt's command, although he made an effort to improve discipline. He had the confiscated cattle disposed of correctly through military channels. He had Morant and Handcock locate and destroy stills the men were using to make spirits, and he had a group of troopers arrested for stealing rum and threatening to shoot Lieutenant Picton for reporting the theft to Hunt. When the men involved absconded, Lenihan had them caught and charged, but they made accusations of misconduct against the officers at Fort Edward, and Colonel Hall ordered them to be discharged from service without a full inquiry. Hunt at this time also admonished Morant for bringing in prisoners. On several occasions he told him that Kitchener's orders were to take no prisoners, and that any Boer prisoners found wearing items of British uniform could be executed by firing squad without being brought in for trial. A new detachment of 20 men under Lieutenant Whitten arrived at Spelonken on the 4th of August, while Hunt was on a mission to locate local commando leader Veldkornet Baron Viljoen. Whitten never met his commanding officer, as Percy Hunt was killed attempting a surprise attack with 17 troopers on a farm at Duvelskoof, where a group of some 36 Boer commandos were believed to be gathered. The Reverend Reuter, a local missionary, had reported to Hunt that Viljoen's commandos had been harassing local non-combatant farmers and had made threats against the mission station. When a Bushveld Carbineer patrol was ambushed near the Bedingen mission station, Hunt led a patrol from Fort Edward on the 2nd of August accompanied by Tony Shiel, a defector from the Boer commandos working as an intelligence scout for Captain Taylor, with the intention of ambushing the Viljoen commando force. In effect, Shiel's task was to raise the natives to attack Boer farms, and he commanded some 400 irregular troops, Majaji warriors from the local Lobidu people. Hunt was warned not to attack the farm that night without Shiel's support and normal reconnaissance. Against this advice he did so, and found the Boers had more numbers than expected and were able to drive off their attackers, killing Hunt and another trooper in the process. At least 2 Boers, including Viljoen, were also killed. When news of the failed attack reached Morant, he assumed command but was visibly distressed to the point of being unable to address the men. Morant always claimed that he and Hunt were best friends, were engaged to two sisters back in Devon, and had joined the Bushveld Carbineers in order to fight as brothers in arms. He led the mounted group to Sweetwaters, 2 kilometres away, where Taylor addressed them, emphasising that no quarter should be given in avenging their captain's death. Morant's group met up with the survivors of Hunt's patrol an hour after they buried Hunt. Morant visited the grave before pursuing the Boers and finally located them camped in a native kraal. Morant, apparently grief-stricken and angered by reports that Hunt's body had been mutilated at Duivelskoof, attacked hastily and lost the element of surprise. All the Boers fled except one named Visser, who had been wounded in the foot and could not walk. Visser had in his possession an old British Army coat and trousers, which Morant claimed were Hunt's. In spite of pleas and protests from Lieutenant Whitten, Morant had Visser shot by firing squad the next day. As he was too wounded to stand, he was shot while seated on the ground. After all the men in the firing squad fired, he was still alive, and Lieutenant Picton shot him in the head at close range. The trousers were later found not to be Hunt's, and the mutilation, which was said to be also apparent on the bodies of the dead Boers at Duivelskoof, was thought by many to be the result of rituals performed by local Libido witch doctors. This must have been done after both sides had retired. However, it was also reported by those who buried Hunt that his neck had been broken and his face damaged. On the 22nd of August, a report reached Fort Edward that 8 prisoners were being brought in by a patrol. A detailed account of the events that followed was later written by Lieutenant Whitten. A patrol subsequently set out, consisting of Lieutenants Morant, Handcock and myself, Sergeant Major Hammett and 2 troopers. We first called at the office of Captain Taylor. Morant dismounted and had a private interview with that officer. I was not informed as to the nature of it. We went on, and Morant said that it was his intention to have the prisoners shot. Both myself and Sergeant Major Hammett asked Morant if he was sure he was doing right. He replied that he was quite justified in shooting the Boers, he had his orders, and he would rely upon us to obey him. I also afterwards remonstrated with him for having the prisoners brought in and shot so close to the fort, but he said it was a matter of indifference where they were shot. We met the patrol with the prisoners about 10 kilometres out. Morant at once took charge and instructed the escort to go on ahead as advance guard. I rode on in front of the wagon, and I did not see any civilians speak to the prisoners as we were passing the mission hospital. When we had trekked on about 5 kilometres, Morant stopped the wagon, called the men off the road and questioned them. Upon his asking, "Have you any more information to give?" they were shot. One of them, a big, powerful Dutchman, made a rush at me and seized the end of my rifle, with the intention of taking it and shooting me, but I simplified matters by pulling the trigger and shooting him. I never had any qualms of conscience for having done so. By just escaping death in this tragedy, I was afterwards sentenced to suffer death. While Morant and some troopers buried the Boers, Whitten returned to the fort with the wagons, dead men's belongings and the oxen, and handed everything to Taylor. Not long after Morant returned, a German missionary, Reverend Daniel Heese, who had been talking to the prisoners when the convoy stopped at the Swiss mission hospital, was seen passing the fort in his buggy on his way to Petersburg. At the Swiss mission hospital, Heese had spoken to the Boer prisoners, some of whom said they were afraid they would be shot. He was threatened with arrest by Morant and ordered to report to Taylor at Sweetwaters. Heese told Taylor that he would report what he knew to a British officer at Petersburg. Taylor suggested he tie a white flag to his mule buggy, and Heese left. Morant then saw him passing the fort and rode out and spoke to him. When he returned to the fort, he told Whitten that he'd advised the man to wait until he could be escorted on the dangerous road, but the missionary had a permit to travel signed by Taylor. Morant then went to Sweetwaters and talked with Taylor. According to Whitten, Morant came back and talked to Lieutenant Hancock, who had his breakfast and went away again. Almost a week later, the missionary's body and that of his native servant Silas were found some distance off the road, 25 kilometres from the fort. Heath had been shot through the chest. Morant said he had warned him not to travel alone, and the Boers must have shot him. It has always been assumed, however, that Morant and Taylor discussed the matter and sent Hancock to shoot Heath to prevent him reaching Petersburg and informing the British authorities of the Carbineers' activities. The British officer at Petersburg to whom Heath referred was probably Frederick de Bertadano, who had lent him the mule buggy to take a sick friend to the Swiss mission. It is also quite likely that Silas and other native boys were gathering information for de Bertadano from native servants working at Fort Edward. Major Lenihan arrived at Fort Edward on the 7th of September 1901, the same day Rolf van Staden and his sons Rolf and Christian were coming in to surrender and get medical treatment for 14-year-old Christian, who was suffering from fever. Morant, Hancock and 2 others met them and shot them near Sweetwater's farm. It was alleged that the 3 were made to dig their own graves before being shot. It was also later alleged that Lenihan was aware of this incident and failed to report it to Colonel Hall. While staying at Fort Edward, Lenihan gave permission for a patrol of 30 men, led by Morant and Whitten, to attempt to capture Tom Kelly, a local Boer guerrilla leader who had fled the district when the Carbineers arrived in May and was now rumoured to be returning with artillery. Lenihan insisted, however, that Kelly be brought in alive, and he was, on the 22nd of September. Morant had patiently conducted an excellent and successful operation. Whitten, who was full of praise for Morant's tactics, leadership and sang-froid, told the following anecdote about the long wait for dawn as they lay in ambush surrounding Kelly's camp. The night was intensely cold, but we lay there, within 50 metres of them until the first streak of dawn. During the night, a dog scented us and started to bark. A Boer got up and gave it a kick to quieten it, at which Morant remarked, "A man never knows his luck in South Africa." Morant was congratulated by Colonel Hall, and, as it seemed the Bushveld Carbineers now had the district under control, he was granted 14 days' leave, which he spent in Pretoria making arrangements for Percy Hunt's belongings to be sent home and sorting out his dead friend's finances and affairs. When he returned to Petersburg from leave, however, Morant was arrested and placed in solitary confinement. Fort Edward was abandoned and the detachment ordered back to Petersburg, where Lenihan, Hancock and Whitten were all placed under arrest on the 23rd of October. After a court of inquiry in November, they were informed of the charges against them, and in December they were told they would be tried by court-martial. Colonel Hall was transferred to India, and the Bushveld Carbineers were reformed as the New Petersburg Light Horse, the name they kept until the disbanding of the regiment in June 1902 at the end of the war. The men were held in solitary confinement for 3 months and refused permission to advise the Australian government of their position. On the 15th of January 1902, the men were shown the charges against them, and Major James Thomas was appointed to defend them. Thomas had commanded A Squadron, New South Wales citizens Bushmen at the siege of Eland's River Post. He had no experience in criminal or military courts. 4 Australian officers, Major Lenihan and Lieutenants Hancock, Whitten and Hannam, and 3 British officers, Captain Taylor and Lieutenants Morant and Picton, had charges made against them, as did Sergeant Major Morrison. Put in simple terms, the following 6 charges were made. 1. On the 2nd of July, 6 Boers captured and shot. Robertson, Taylor and Sergeant Major Morrison charged with murder while on active service. 2. On the 4th of July, Trooper Van Buren was shot. Hancock charged with murder. Lenihan charged with culpable neglect failing to make a report which it was his duty to make. 3. A prisoner named Visser was captured, court-martialed and shot. Morant, Hancock, Whitten and Picton were charged with the offence of murder. 4. On the 3rd of August, 8 Boers surrendered and were shot. Morant, Hancock and Whitten charged with the offence of murder. Reverend Heath shot. Morant and Hancock charged with the offence of murder. 5. On the 5th of September, Lieutenant Hannam ordered his men to shoot into 3 wagons and 250 rounds were fired, 2 little boys were killed and 1 little girl wounded. No charges were filed. 6. On the 7th of September, Morant had 2 Boers and a boy aged 14 taken prisoner and shot. Lenihan charged with culpable neglect failing to make a report which it was his duty to make. Morant and Hancock charged with the offence of murder. The evidence had been gathered over several months, much of it by British intelligence officers, among them de Bertadano. They were attempting to build a case against Taylor and had informed Kitchener of the death of Heath. The killing of Boers was one thing, but murdering a German Lutheran missionary was another matter, and was bound to bring official protests from Germany, which it did. Many researchers believe that it was the death of Heath that triggered the inquiry and the courts-martial, and that Kitchener, who had appointed Taylor and covertly approved his methods, was then reluctantly convinced that Taylor had become a liability, and approved the building of a case against Taylor and the officers of the Bushveld Carbineers, which intelligence officers had already been doing for some time without Kitchener's knowledge. There was a letter signed by 15 Bushveld Carbineer troopers and given to Colonel Hall that was written by a mysterious character named Robert Cochrane, an English-born trooper who had been a mining engineer and Justice of the Peace in Western Australia and was also a journalist. Written in very formal language, the letter called for a full and exhaustive inquiry into the following disgraceful incidents which have occurred in the Spelonken district. It then listed in detail the 6 incidents that later became the formal charges. Cochrane wrote, "Sir, many of us are Australians who have fought throughout nearly the whole war. We cannot return home with the stigma of these crimes attached to our names. Therefore, we humbly pray that a full and exhaustive inquiry may be made by impartial imperial officers in order that the truth may be elicited and justice done." There are 3 odd things about the letter, apart from its formal language and thoroughness of detail. Firstly, only 2 of the 15 troopers who signed it were Australian. Secondly, Cochrane had never served at Fort Edward. And lastly, only one of the men who signed it was called to give evidence against Morant, Hancock and Whitten. 2 others gave evidence against Taylor. It would seem that British intelligence, in collusion with Cochrane, sought out witnesses, built a case against Taylor and the other men, and arranged for the letter to be written. Lenihan's visit to Fort Edward in September was also part of this plan. He was there to gather information about the shooting of the Boer prisoners and Heath. After the arrests and the disbandment of the Bushveld Carbineers, Boer commando activities quickly increased in the Spelonken. Veld Cornet Christian Frederick Bayers returned and occupied Fort Edward and Taylor's old headquarters at Sweetwaters. The reconstituted Carbineers Regiment, known as the New Petersburg Light Horse, proved ineffective at suppressing the renewed Boer commando activity. Bayer's men attacked the blockhouses at the prison compound at Petersburg and freed some 150 Boer prisoners on the night of the 22nd of January 1902. As was expected, the reinforced guerrilla army, now numbering around 300 men, attacked the garrison the following night in an attempt to steal the badly needed British horses and valuable supplies of food and military equipment. The loss of the Petersburg garrison would have been a crushing blow to the British, and had it been successful, could have restarted all-out war in the northern Transvaal. With this possibility imminent, on the night of the 23rd of January, the prisoners were released from their cells, armed, and ordered to help defend the garrison. The blockhouses, which formed the defence posts for the garrison, were overcrowded with men attempting to shoot through the apertures provided. So Morant and Hancock climbed out onto the roof and proceeded to shoot the attackers with scant regard for their own safety. Morant was credited with shooting one of Bayer's commanders, Martinus Pretorius, and the heroic actions of the two prisoners inspired a spirited defence that forced Bayers to withdraw. Major Thomas later requested clemency or pardon from Morant and Hancock on the time-honoured precedent of a British military custom established by none other than the Duke of Wellington. There was no harsher disciplinarian of troops than the famous Iron Duke, the hero of Waterloo and later British Prime Minister. Although he was known to refer to his troops as scum and treat men as expendable, he also believed in a system of honour and fair play, and stated the dictum that the performance of a duty of honour and trust after knowledge of a military offence ought to convey a pardon. On that basis alone, the actions of Morant and Hancock on the night of the 23rd of January 1902 should have secured clemency at least, a pardon in any case, and probably a medal for bravery. The trials. Many Australians believe that Hancock and Morant were truly scapegoats of the Empire, which happens to be the title of the book written about the case in 1907 by the third man sentenced to death, Lieutenant George Whitton. The execution of Hancock and Morant, which was carried out with unseemly haste and without any attempt to inform Australian authorities of the decision, has been regarded by many as yet another example of British perfidy and criminal disregard for Australian soldiers who were treated as mere expendable colonials. The question of the measure of British unfairness or even treachery hinges upon the fact that the accused stated time and again in their own defence that they were certain they had been ordered to behave and fight in a particular way, but were being tried and judged by a completely different set of military rules. The moral debate over the case centres around the dilemma as to whether it is just and reasonable to select and punish a few individual soldiers for what were obviously criminal acts, while ignoring the fact that hundreds of other troops were doing similar things and not being required to answer for their actions. Put simply, did the accused men make criminal decisions of their own volition, or were they following orders that were not in the British Military Handbook, and if so, how far up the chain of command did those orders originate? Taylor had been arrested at the end of September. The other accused were arrested at Petersburg on the 23rd of October and held in separate parts of the prison until the preliminary hearing, the Court of Inquiry, 2 weeks later, on the 6th of November. They were then held in solitary confinement until the end of December, when the court reconvened and they were told they were to be court-martialled. Lenihan was able to secure the legal services of Major Thomas, who was just about to sail for home when the telegram reached him. The two men had known each other in Sydney, and Lenihan was aware that Thomas was a trained solicitor. When he arrived in Petersburg, Thomas became aware that neither Hancock, Morant, Picton nor Whitton had any legal representation and agreed to represent all of them. Trials began on the 16th of January 1902. As previously related, while the trial was underway, Boer commandos led by Christian Frederick Bayers launched an attack on the Petersburg garrison. The prisoners were released from their cells and armed, and Morant and Hancock turned the tide of the attack and the Boers withdrew. Major Thomas later filed for clemency, but the court dismissed his request. Upon being cross-examined, witnesses stated that Captain Hunt had given them orders not to take prisoners, and they had been reprimanded for bringing them in. Morant stated that under Captain Hunt he had been clearing the northern district of Boers. He said he believed Captain Hunt acted on orders from Pretoria to clear the Spelonken district and take no prisoners. He stated that Captain Hunt told him that Colonel Ian Hamilton, military secretary, had given him the orders at Lord Kitchener's private house just before his departure to take charge at Fort Edward. Morant also stated in his defence that it was known that other units, notably the Canadian Scouts, Strathcona's Horse, and other brigades of Kitchener's, had acted in exactly the same manner. Morant stated that he never questioned the validity of the orders, he was certain they were correct. When questioned as to whether his open-air court-martial and summary execution of Visser had been constituted under the King's regulations, Morant famously replied, "No, it was not quite so handsome. As to rules and sections, we had no red book, and knew nothing about them. We were out fighting the Boers, not sitting comfortably behind barbed wire entanglements. We got them, and we shot them, under Rule 303. The verdicts and outcomes varied considerably. Lieutenant Hannam was not even brought to trial on the fifth charge, as there was some evidence that he was unaware children were present in the wagons, and some of those on the wagons had run when called to surrender. Lieutenant Picton was simply cashiered from the army. Sergeant Major Morrison was not convicted. Captain Taylor, who had resigned his commission when arrested, stood accused of ordering the massacre of 6 unarmed men and boys on the 2nd of July 1901 and the theft of their money and livestock and the murder of an unarmed native. All charges against him were dismissed. Captain Robertson, having been forced to resign his commission in July, turned prosecution witness and no charges were ever laid against him. He gave evidence against Taylor, as did Lieutenant Picton. Morant, Handcock and Whitten were petitioned by the prosecution to do the same and testify against Taylor, but all three refused and stuck fast, insisting they had been ordered to take no prisoners and had been told that Boer prisoners wearing items of British uniform could be shot after a summary court-martial in the field. They believed that those orders came from Kitchener via Colonel Hamilton via Captain Hunt to them. Morant was acquitted of murdering Heath, but Morant, Handcock and Whitten were found guilty of the murder of the 8 Boers and all other charges. I believe that in refusing to testify for the prosecution against Taylor, Morant, Handcock and Whitten metaphorically signed their own death warrants. All three were sentenced to death, and Whitten's sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. He was imprisoned in Britain, and there was strong pressure from Australia for his release, including legal advice from Sir Isaac Isaacs, who would later become Australia's Governor-General. Whitten was released in August 1904, but not pardoned. On the 27th of February 1902, Morant and Handcock were shot by a firing squad of Cameron Highlanders. There is certainly a case to be made that Morant and Handcock were victims of Kitchener's attempts to back down and soften the savagery of the campaign he had covertly approved against Boer civilians. The attempt to show that British justice existed even in war was a gesture meant to appease both the Boers and the Germans. It was also a token response to the voices of criticism at home in Britain. British welfare campaigner Emily Hobhouse published a report on the concentration camps in June 1901 that led Lloyd George to accuse the government of a policy of extermination against the Boer population. Liberal opposition party leader Henry Campbell Bannerman asked in Parliament, "When is a war not a war?" and gave the rhetorical answer, "When it is carried on by methods of barbarism in South Africa." Labour peer Thomas Pakenham described Kitchener's scorched earth tactic as organised like a sporting shoot, with success to find in a weekly bag of killed, captured and wounded, and to sweep the country bare of everything that could give sustenance to the guerrillas, including women and children. In Kitchener's defence, he was merely taking the measures put in place by Lord Roberts to another level, and was constantly being criticised in South Africa by the governor of the Cape Colony and others for not doing more to annihilate the Boers. It was the clearance of civilians that dominated the last phase of the war. 30,000 Boer farms were destroyed by the British, and Afrikaner men were hanged outside their houses. The plan included the systematic destruction of crops, the slaughtering or removal of livestock, and the burning down of homesteads and farms to prevent the Boers from returning to the fight. The concentration camp system saw whole regions depopulated. 45 tent city concentration camps were built for Boer internees, and there were another 64 for black Africans. Of the 28,000 Boers taken as prisoners of war, 25,630 were sent overseas, so the vast majority of Boers remaining in the local camps were women and children. Women whose husbands had not surrendered were given less rations than those whose husbands had been killed or transported to prisoner of war camps in Bermuda, Canada, St Helena and other parts of the Empire so they could not rejoin the fight. The official combatant death toll from the Second South African War is an odd statistic. Official British Army losses were around 22,000 men, and Boer Army losses around 4,000. However, it is estimated that between 26,000 and 28,000 people, 1/4 of all internees, almost all women and children, died in concentration camps of disease and starvation. Banjo Patterson, as a war correspondent, was appalled at the acts of brutality carried out by British troops against Boer civilians. "Come, let us join in the bloodthirsty shriek, hurrah for Lord Kitchener's bag, though the fireman's torch and the hangman's cord, they are hung on the English flag. In front of our brave old army, whoop, the farmhouse blazes bright, and their women weep, and their children die. How dare they presume to fight? And none of them dress in a uniform, the same as by rights they ought. They're fighting in rags and in naked feet, like Wallace's Scotchmen fought. They clothe themselves from our captured troops, and they're catching 'em every week. But they don't hang 'em. That shame is ours. But we cover the shame with a shriek." Morant and Hancock as volunteers were perhaps not au fait with the subtleties of regular army methods. Hunt made several attempts to make Morant understand that no prisoners meant shoot them before they surrender. Morant was admonished for bringing in prisoners, and then made the mistake of taking prisoners and then killing them. Kitchener needed to make some effort to appease the Boers, Germany, and those who opposed his all-out war policy at home, and sentencing 3 war criminals from the wild frontier territory to death and executing 2 of them was one way to do it. Although he abandoned Balala Taylor after the death of Heese, Kitchener had a lot to lose if his man Taylor was found guilty, and he possibly had the trial delayed 3 months so Taylor could be tried as an ex-army civilian. 3 other scapegoats, 2 of them colonials, did not pose any real problem to Kitchener. Although Kitchener eventually admitted that 10,000 natives were armed by the British during the hostilities, he was also at great pains to distance himself from his previous support of Taylor's activities. Many other British troops also believed there was an unwritten "no prisoners" order. Morant himself wrote, the evening before he died, "It really ain't the place nor time to reel off rhyming diction, but yet we'll write a final rhyme, whilst waiting crucifixion. But we bequeath a parting tip, for sound advice of such men who come across in transport ship to polish off the Dutchman. If you encounter any Boers, you really must not loot 'em, and if you wish to leave these shores, for pity's sake, don't shoot 'em. And if you'd earn a DSO, why, every British sinner should know the proper way to go is, ask the Boer to dinner." Morant's last words are often claimed to have been, "Shoot straight, you bastards, don't make a mess of it." A letter written by a prison warder who witnessed the execution, however, states they were, "Be sure and make a good job of it." Conclusion. Edwin Henry Murrant, or Harry Harbord Morant, whoever he was a skilful horseman, a very competent writer of sentimental verse, and an extraordinarily brave soldier. He was also an unreliable friend, a liar, and a man who rarely paid his debts or honoured his commitments. He was not Australian. He committed acts that can be considered war crimes, possibly in a spirit of revenge. In order to hasten the end of the guerrilla war, British intelligence secretly constructed a case against Captain Arthur Taylor in order to stop his brutal killing and illegal profiteering activities in the Spelonken district. For various reasons, including a fear of Lord Kitchener's real involvement being revealed, the case failed to produce the desired result. Morant and Hancock, in refusing to testify against Taylor, became the sacrificial scapegoats. The much vilified Lieutenant Hancock did kill a fellow trooper, and quite probably a civilian missionary. In each case, he followed a direct order from his immediate superior officer. He deserves his name to be on the honour roll of those who enlisted and served, as much as any other man who enlisted and served. Hancock and Morant should, by any reasonable sense of British military honour, have been pardoned for any crimes committed in wartime due to their heroic action in defending a threatened British garrison, which included the men who were their accusers and jailers on the night of the 23rd of January 1902. Colonel J. St. Clair, who observed the court proceedings, summed up the official British Army position in a confidential report to the War Office. I agree generally with the views expressed by the Court of Inquiry. The idea that no prisoners were to be taken in the Spelonken area appears to have been started up by the late Captain Hunt, and after his death continued by orders given personally by Captain Taylor. Lieutenant Morant acquiesced in the illegal execution of the wounded Boer Visser and took a personal part in the massacre of the 8 surrendered Boers on the 23rd of August. After the murder of Van Buren, the officers seem to have exercised a reign of terror in the district, which hindered their men from reporting their illegal acts and even prevented their objecting to assist in the crime. The first published account of the incidents surrounding the case appeared as early as 1902, the same year Morant and Hancock were executed. It was a little book titled Bushman and Buccaneer, a memoir of Harry Morant, His Ventures and Verses, written by Australian journalist Frank Fox under the pen name of Frank Renard, with a cover drawing by Norman Lindsay. Fox wrote for the Bulletin and edited the Lone Hand magazine and later worked on British papers as a political and military commentator, served with distinction in World War I and was knighted. In 1907, the other man originally sentenced to death, Lieutenant George Whitton, published his account of the affair, Scapegoats of the Empire. The South African wars were neglected and almost forgotten for a time once World War I began, and it was decades later, in 1959, after 2 world wars, that Rain Kruger's book, Goodbye Dolly Gray, aroused some interest and reopened some debate. Prior to the reawakened interest in the case in Australia, brought about by the Bruce Beresford film in 1980, there was Breaker Morant, A Horseman Who Made History, by Frederick Cutlack in 1962, The Breaker, a novel, by Kit Denton in 1973, and In Search of Breaker Morant, by Margaret Carnegie and Frank Shields in 1979. Bruce Beresford's film, Breaker Morant, was actually based on a play by Kenneth Ross, who successfully sued Angus and Robertson, the publisher of Denton's novel, for publicising that book as the source material for the film. Since that time, more books have been written, all attempting to uncover the truth behind the only execution by British firing squad of British soldiers in the Second South African War. Breaker Morant and the Bushveld Carbineers by Arthur Davey, 1987. The Bushveld Carbineers and the Petersburg Light Horse by William Woolmore, 2002. Shoot Straight You Bastards by Nick Blazinski, 2003. Breaker Morant, The Final Roundup by Joel West and Roger Roper, 2016. And Ready, Aim, Fire, Major James Francis Thomas, the fourth victim in the execution of Lieutenant Harry Breaker Morant by James Uncles, 2019. In 2009, James William Uncles, a Naval Reserve commander and barrister, sent petitions for pardons for Morant, Hancock and Whitten to both the Queen and the Petitions Committee of the Australian Parliament. In November 2010, the UK Ministry of Defence replied, "After detailed historical and legal consideration, the Secretary of State has concluded that no new primary evidence has come to light which supports the petition to overturn the original courts-martial verdicts and sentences." In 2012, the Australian Attorney General's Department announced that it would not seek a pardon for Morant from the British government, as a pardon for a Commonwealth offence would generally only be granted where the offender is both morally and technically innocent of the offence. Afterword. "Let the jury consider their verdict," the King said, for about the 20th time that day. "No, no," said the Queen. "Sentence first, verdict afterwards." Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll, 1865. Understanding our culture and society in order to make what we call human progress is like rowing a boat. We advance by looking backward while moving forward. If we don't understand where we are coming from, we can only move forward in ignorance and repeat the mistakes of the past. The truth about past events is always somewhere in the background circumstances in which they occurred. If you study the politics and mercenary motivations of those involved, the social conventions, religious beliefs and nationalistic agendas of the time, you will stumble upon the truth eventually. It's all there, somewhere in the past. We choose to ignore or misunderstand the past at our peril. If you apply a whole new set of rules to history, you risk drifting into some sort of parallel universe where nothing really makes sense, a wonderland of your own creation where, in effect, you can easily falsify the past. The reason I chose to use quotations from Lewis Carroll throughout this collection, apart from the fact that they make me laugh a lot, is quite simple. The worlds Alice encountered down the rabbit hole and through the looking glass, and the world in which the elusive Snark was hunted, are worlds in which real history does not exist. They are worlds full of Furphies. Finally, here is one last example of this, from our not-so-distant past. Well, from the early 20th century, which is a century ago, admittedly, but doesn't seem that long to someone my age. It's a story about how someone who was much loved and very famous could, within a few decades, be best remembered for something that never happened. Roy Reen was born Henry van der Sluis in Adelaide in 1891. With his irreverent and unique style of comedy, he was the most popular variety act in Australia for the first half of the 20th century. He shaped the Aussie sense of humour through his stage appearances and the character Mo Mackaki in the radio program Mackaki Moments. His material ranged from corny wordplay and slapstick to character comedy. On radio, he was always hitting his cheeky son, Harry, and exclaiming, "Cop that, young Harry!" Other Mo catchphrases like "Strike me lucky" and "You beaut" became part of Aussie vernacular. The radio character of Spencer the Garbage Man, played by actor Harry Avondale, provided Mo with plenty of opportunities for low comedy, olfactory jokes and the catchphrase, "Oh, phew!" Another running gag in the radio show consisted of Mo attempting to recite a poem titled The Barmaid and the Butcher, but never being allowed to begin. While Mo's comedy often suggested that he was about to be vulgar, he never was. By today's standards, he was very politically incorrect, but never overtly vulgar. In fact, he was scathing about performers who crossed the line into what was then called blue comedy, and was remembered by his wife and children as almost prudish in his private life. Oddly, however, the most repeated story about his theatre performances is about a very crude routine that he is supposed to have performed with his partner of many years, Nat "Stiffy" Phillips. The routine supposedly had Mo visiting an optometrist, played by Phillips, for an eye test. Every time Phillips wrote F on a blackboard, Mo read it as K. The punchline of the routine has Phillips asking, "How come every time I write F, you see K?" Now, the interesting thing about this story is that it is the most common anecdote told about Mo's stage career. Whenever Mo's name comes up in conversation, you can bet someone will tell you the story, implying that Mo's comedy was often vulgar and bawdy. The truth is that there is no evidence that the routine was ever performed in any theatre anywhere in Australia or New Zealand where the two comedians appeared. There is no mention of the sketch in any old theatre program notes, and no one who knew the duo can ever recall them doing it, because they never did. It would have been totally outside Mo's style of comedy and unacceptable to theatre managers and Mo's audiences. The only time Mo was ever in trouble for going too far was in Adelaide in the 1920s, when he made a remark about the city's statues that drew a letter of complaint to the theatre. The sad thing about this Furphy is that it completely distorts the truth about Mo's career and memories of his comedic style by making him remembered for something he never did. Finally, I maintain that the true stories are often far more interesting than the Furphies anyway. You've been listening to Great Furphies of Australian History by Jim Haynes, narrated by Jim Haynes. Published by Wavesound Audiobooks, an imprint of W.F. Howes Limited. This work is copyrighted Jim Haynes, 2021. This recording is copyrighted 2021 W.F. Howes Limited.